Hi everybody, Vigorous Rapscallion here with part 2 of our improved grabbing tutorial. As I mentioned in the last video, we're going to be setting up something like the Grabbity gloves from Half Life Alyx. So let's see how they work. And there you go. You just grip, point at the object you want, release, and it comes flying towards you. Just like that. Now, I know I mentioned in the last video I was going to go over how to highlight these objects so that you can tell more easily which one you're pointing at. But to be honest, it turns out that's pretty much a video on its own that's more complicated than you'd think. So for now, we've just got a sound cue, but I'm going to show you how to set up the actual functionality here. So the very first thing we're going to want to do is take our modified VR pawn from last time and make a duplicate of it, just for a sort of version control in case something goes terribly wrong. It's always good to have a backup. Let's call this VR pawn Grabbity gloves, and let's open that up. So you may remember in the last video that pretty much everything we changed was either in this function here, the get grab component near motion controller, or in the actual grab component itself. So let's take a look at this function, and we added this distance feature to the sphere trace. Before we put this back, we're going to want a lot of this logic for a function we need later. So first, let's go ahead, grab this, and duplicate that function. And let's call this get Grabbity candidate. And as you can see, we've got the exact same thing going on here. So going back to our get nearest grab component, we're going to undo pretty much everything we did in the last video because all that functionality is now going to be handled by this Grabbity glove function. So delete all that, and then you're going to want to take that local grip position and plug that back into end. So now we have our standard grab again. Easy as that. So now what do we need to change in this get Grabbity candidate function? For one, 100 is pretty low for what we're doing. If you've played Alyx or any game with that sort of distance grabbing, you can grab things from pretty far away. So let's go ahead and bump that up to 700. And when you're dealing with stuff that's that far away, it's going to be a little harder to target. So let's also go ahead and bump this grab radius from grip position up to 10. Great. And next we want to change what we're returning from this function. Right now what we're returning is a grab component. And we're going to be needing to apply physics to the object that that component is attached to. You can't do that from the grab component, so we're going to have to get a static mesh instead, so we have something to apply the physics to. That being said, we don't necessarily want to get rid of this little piece of logic here. What this is doing is checking, are there any grab components on this actor? We still want to check that, so let's leave that all as is. But then all this, which is mainly there in case the object has multiple grab components, so that the program can figure out which one is closest to the hand and snap to that one, we don't need any of that. So let's go ahead and delete it. Next, in the case that this condition is true, we want to grab the static mesh. So we're going to pull out from there and do get component. There'll only be one most likely mesh on here, at least the way I have everything set up in this project. So it's just going to be get component by class. We don't need to be worrying about arrays or anything like that. And then we're going to look for static mesh. Now you want static mesh component, not static mesh actor or anything like that. You want the component. So next we're going to need a variable to hold our static mesh that we're going to be applying physics to. So let's put that in local variables. We're going to be returning this to the main event graph. Let's call this Grabbity candidate. And then we want to make sure that the type is once again static mesh component. That one right there. If you're having trouble with it, the most likely culprit is that you've accidentally chosen a different type of static mesh. That's got to be the component. Next, we're going to drag that out to set it, and we only want to set that in the case that the object in question did have a grab component. So drag off that true branch. Then we're going to plug that in. Then we need to go back over here to our return statement. Let's go ahead and delete that. We don't need it anymore. Click on our return node, and we need to change the type of output to also a static mesh component. Then we're going to grab our Grabbity candidate, drag that out, plug that into the nearest component return, and there you go. That's about all we're going to need to do for now. There is one more thing we want to do here before we leave this function. Just for testing purposes, we want a way to check if it's actually recognizing objects at a distance. So let's go ahead and just use a sound for that. Let's do play sound 2D. And I'm just going to use this click on button cue. You want something short because this is going to play repeatedly every time it recognizes the object, so you don't want a super long sound. Next, we need to think about when do we want this new function to trigger. Well, we want it to be triggering continuously whenever the grip button is held down. Now, we're only going to do this for the right hand today. I'm going to try and set it up robustly so it's pretty easy to do it for the left hand. But just for the sake of keeping the video short, I'd have to do everything twice. Not everything, but a good amount of things twice. So we're just going to stick with the right hand. So every tick that this is held down is going to be triggered. So we're going to drag off of that. Well, first we're going to grab our new function here, the get Grabbity candidate. And you can see it needs a couple of inputs too. Let's lead triggered up to that. Then for motion controller, we just grab motion controller right grip and put that into motion controller, and hand right for the hand component. And next we're going to need a reference to this Grabbity candidate in our main event graph here. So let's go ahead and call that Grabbity object, because it is no longer the candidate. And let's make sure that is, yep, static mesh component. Drag that out to set it. There we go. And then let's clean all this up a little bit. That's looking nicer. Great. So we really only want to set this though if we're returning something valid. This can return null, which we can use to our advantage later. But we only want to set this object here if this is returning something that exist. So we're going to use an isValid for that. First, to break the link between this and set, go ahead and drag out from nearest component, type in isValid, and then you want this one with the question mark next to it. In the case it is valid, we move on to set, and this nearest component return we set our Grabbity object as. Now you might see another problem here where we don't want this function triggering while we're holding an object in this hand, nor do we want it to trigger if there's currently an object close enough to just pick up. So that's going to be super easy. We're just going to use a Boolean with a branch here. Let's go ahead and make that Boolean first. Let's call this right hand grab. Switch that to a Boolean, compile, it should be starting as false, great. Drag that out, drag a branch out from that, and then between triggered and the get Grabbity candidate, plug that in, and in the case that the condition is false, if the right hand is not currently grabbing something, then we want to run this function. Okay, that all looks good, but we're also going to need to set that Boolean at some point, so let's go ahead and do it really anytime after this part of the logic here, after try grab and then the branch checking if it's true. You can put it anytime after that. I'm going to put it right after it. So let's go ahead and set. Right hand grab to true. Then we're also going to need to reset that Boolean when we drop the object, so right here on completed, at the end of this line of logic here, duplicate that set, bring that down, except now we want to set it to false. Next we need to go into our VR game mode, which is our default for this map here. Let's do VR game mode. And we need to change our pawn. So right now it's on VR pawn modified. Let's go ahead and make that VR pawn Grabbity gloves. And let's see if it's working so far. And I lost the audio for this part, but right here you can see that the objects do make a noise when you hold the grip button and point at them, and they do not do the same when you are currently holding an object. Now next, once we let go of that grip button when it's completed, we want something to happen with this Grabbity object. But before we get to that, we only want that to happen if the object didn't get picked up. So we're going to use this same right-hand grab variable, and we're going to pull out a branch from that. And then from completed here, we're going to plug that branch in. Now in this case, in the case it's true that the object has been picked up, then we just want to do this standard object release logic that we already have. Before we go any further here, let's go ahead and make some room on the event graph, because we're going to need it. So just grab everything from right-hand grab upwards, move that way up, give yourself plenty of room down there below it. Because what we're going to be doing to apply physics to this Grabbity object is we're not going to be using a function. And that's because we need some kind of dynamic timer features that we just can't use in functions or can't use easily. So instead we're going to do this all in event tick. So let's go ahead and get ourselves an event tick. There we go. And then we need some kind of flow control here. So let's get ourselves another Boolean. And let's call this flying object. Add an extra capital in there. Let's fix that. Compile. Should default to false. So we want to first check if flying object is true. So let's pull out a branch, hook that up, and in the case it's true, we want to start doing things with this object. Now for our initial setup here, we're going to do kind of a simplified version of what you saw at the beginning of this video, and then we're going to add in more details, just because it gets rather hard to think about if you set up the full functionality and then test it. It's definitely better to do this piecemeal so that if you run into a problem, it's easy to identify. So to start with, let's just set something up so the object just floats directly to the hand. And for that, we're going to need a reference to two things. We're going to need this motion controller right grip, so go ahead and grab a reference to that. And then we're going to need our Grabbity object, so go ahead and grab a reference to that as well. Then we're going to go ahead and get world location for both. Get location and get location. Now what we want from this is directional vector, so let's go ahead and grab that. You're going to want this get unit direction parentheses vector down here. From and to. So we're going from, oh wait, I actually want this reversed. My bad. So let's move these so that they match up. So get unit direction. So we want from the object to the motion controller. And this is going to return us values between 0 and 1. So as we've done in other videos, we're going to have to multiply this value. Let's drag that out and multiply. And to not bore you with the numerous guess and check I had to do, we're just going to set that to 200. Now there is going to be a problem here if we just set the impulse, which is the object is constantly going to be dragged down by gravity. So let's also go ahead and set the gravity for this object. In the case this is true, we want gravity disabled. And then we want to be adding impulse every tick. But that's also going to be a little too much, so we want some way to control how often this happens. And this is a neat little function I found on the forums, kind of a cool workaround for getting things to happen every few seconds in the event tick without using the multiplying by delta seconds, which isn't really going to work for this setup. So what we're going to do is use a do once and a delay. So let's grab a do once. Then we want to set the impulse for this object. So add that impulse. And take our unit direction vector, multiply by whatever our scalar is, in this case 200. Plug that in, so now it's going to be moving towards the player. Then we want a delay. So what this is going to do is every time this duration gets to the end, we're going to trigger completed and go back to this do once. Because of the do once, the event tick isn't going to be resetting that delay, so basically this allows you to control how often that happens. So let's make this 10 times a second, 0.1 seconds. And sorry, I'm recording this at the end of the video here. I don't know how this ended up on the cutting room floor, but you also need to set flying object to true. So alpha this completed branch. In the case that the object has not been picked up, the right-hand grab is false. Drag out of that false, and set flying object to true. And this would be a good time to go ahead and test the functions you have set up so far, and make sure this all works correctly, so let's do that now. Now this is working somewhat. The cube does come to your hand. However, there's still some major problems. For one, we have not re-enabled gravity when we drop the cube, so it just continues to not have gravity applied to it and continues to follow the hand. In addition to that, you can point at objects while the other object is in the air, and if you click on them with the grip button, then they're going to become the new referenced object and start behaving strangely, as you can see. Next, we need to think about in what conditions we want to reset this flying object variable and stop executing all of this logic. Well, there's a couple of things that can happen. One, if enough time goes by, we probably just want this to reset by default. The other conditions are if the object passes close enough to the hand that the player could conceivably grab it, but they failed to, we want it to reset then. Or if they did grab it, we obviously want it to reset in that case as well. So luckily we can kind of double up on that function, because if you were able to grab it, then by default it did pass close enough to your hand. So let's go ahead and get the distance between these two vectors. Oops, not get distance, we're just going to want distance. Let's go ahead and grab distance vector there, and then put both of these world locations in, and our return value in this case is going to be a float. Now, we probably want to check if it's the same or less than our grab radius, which is 10. So let's pull out a less. Let's do a less equal and make that 10. And that's the second condition we want to check for now before we execute the rest of this. So pull off from that, put a branch back here, plug that same true condition for flying object in. And if this is false, if the object is further away than 10 unreal units, we want to just execute everything we're executing. But if it's true, we want to reset this flying object to false, and we want to re-enable gravity on this object. So let's go ahead and type in enable gravity, and go ahead and check that box. Okay, this should be working a little better now. Let's go ahead and test out what we've changed. Okay, so now if everything went according to plan, once we activate an object, it should fly towards the hand. Once it passes through the hand, it should stop having impulse added to it, and it should also have gravity re-enabled, so it should drop to the ground. And there we go. You can see as soon as the object passes through, it goes back to its old functionality and stops following the hand. Let's make sure it works with the grab too. You can see if you grab the object, that also resets it. There are still some problems here. For one, you can kind of go to another object before that function has completed. So I'll show you that. And if you do that, now there's no way for that object to have gravity re-enabled on it because it's been dereferenced as the, grab object. So it's just going to keep flying no matter what happens afterwards. And now you can barely see it. But
there's a couple ways we could fix that, but the one I'm most fond of is just not allowing the player to try and do two objects at once with the Grabbity glove, which is how it works in most games I've seen with this type of functionality, and that's also going to be the easiest solution. So let's set that up next.
So in order to ensure that the player can't try and have two objects once going with this, we're going to add another flow control variable. We're going to call this one isFlying, for if the object is currently in the process of flying. We're going to want to set that here to true. And then in the case that flying object has been reset, we want to set this back to false. You could do this at a couple places in the chain of logic, but this is a perfectly acceptable one. And in the case that's false, we don't need to worry about hooking it up to this branch. In fact, we don't want to. So make sure that that's just hanging off the end there and is setting that back to false. Next, let's go ahead and expand this a little, give ourselves a little more room, and move the normal grab functionality up a bit, move this back, and just kind of space everything out a bit more. And where do we want to check for this new variable, this isFlying variable? Well, we don't even want the person to be able to set a new reference to this grabby object while the object is currently flying. So we want it right here. Let's go ahead and move this stuff over. A little more room there. We're going to grab that isFlying variable, shoot a branch off from it, and we want both of these false. So false to false, and isFlying is false. So now if the object is currently in the air, you won't be able to choose a new grab candidate. So this is another good point to test. Let's go ahead and make sure that this chain of logic works and prevents us from attempting to grab another object while an object is flying.
So because of where we interrupted the chain of logic here, we shouldn't even get that sound cue if we point at another object while one is flying. So let me get one kind of far away there. And you can see I'm pointing at other objects, nothing is happening. And when I drop that one, it goes back to having Grabbity enabled. But you can see there's another problem. Say that the object just misses the player's hand completely. Well, now it's going to start doing some really weird stuff. Because of the way that we're adding impulse, like if you move your hand to try and get to the thing, it's not really going to work. It's basically, orbiting right now because of how this works. And it'll eventually reach the hand. You can see that becoming kind of more elliptical. But obviously this isn't how we want the gloves to work. And because the player can't grab anything else while this is happening, you just got an object floating around you in space. So we want to fix that, and my favorite way to do that is just with a timer. We know the furthest distance away an object can be to try and use this function. So we can sort of guesstimate what the maximum time it will take. Let's just say 1.5 seconds. That's probably a little long, if anything. But let's set this up so that if the object is flying for more than 1.5 seconds, the whole thing resets in the same way it does when it passes through the palm.
So how are we going to keep track of time here and do something once a certain amount of time has passed? Well, luckily with this delay over here with a duration of 0.1, we know that happens 10 times a second. So if we only want this to happen for 1.5 seconds, we just need to have it happen 15 times. So we're going to use a simple integer flow control here. Let's call this time elapsed Grabbity. Make that an integer, default to 0. And then every time this happens, we want to increment this by 1 in the case that this isn't already above our value. So let's put this right after the disable Grabbity. Let's grab our integer. Grab a less, or less equal to, make that 15, and add a branch in there. So as long as this is less than 15, we're all going to be hunky-dory, and we're going to keep doing that. Now, in the case that it's over 15, we want this all to reset. And luckily, with branches, you can be sneaky and just apply that end of the branch back to that kind of reset function we have up here, where a flying object is set back to false, and enable gravity is re-enabled. So then we also need to increment this every time that this executes. So that's easy enough to do. Let's put that right before the delay. Grab out from there, plus plus. And there we go. So it's going to increment by 1 every 1/10 of a second. And once that has all been set up, we also need to make sure that we're resetting this flow control variable whenever this little reset function happens. So we're just going to go ahead and set that to 0. Let's go ahead and do that. And while we're at it, we don't necessarily want to keep this reference to the gravity object once this is reset. Otherwise, if the player were to press the grip button again, basically the same object would fly to their hand again, whether or not they were pointing at it. So we want to go ahead and set that to null. So drag that out and set, and all you need to do to set to null is just like that, set it with nothing plugged in. Alright, let's see if that all works.
Okay, let's take a look. So that's all still working fine. We didn't break anything. As it passes through the palm, it's still resetting like that. You still can't select 2 at once. And last, if we miss the hand here, which I believe we just did, whoopah, then after a few seconds, it just resets automatically. So that way you don't have that object continuing to follow you, and you are able to pick a different object. Now this is really all you need to start messing around with how the object flies. Right now it is a little bit boring, since it just kind of flies towards your hand. You're also probably going to want to up that grab radius, because it is a little harder to grab these when they're moving. But, as promised at the beginning of the video, I'm going to show you how to set it up so it looks like it does in Half Life Alyx, where the object kind of bounces to you, and it's fun to grab it, and it's a little bit more dynamic. But with what you have set up here, you can go ahead and start messing around with your own ways of doing this. I had a lot of fun while I was making this video, finding different ways to make the cube fly to your hand, so I highly suggest messing around with that a bit. It's a good time. But for now, I'll show you how to set it up so it looks like it does in Alyx.
Okay, so the first thing, which it took me an embarrassingly long time to figure out, is the way Alyx has it set up doesn't actually disable the gravity on the object. It's all done through setting impulse at standard gravity. So first thing we're going to want to do is get rid of everything we had that's messing with gravity. Let's go ahead and do that, and then let's reorganize a little bit here. Move this over, get ourselves a bit more room. And then since we're now fighting gravity this whole time, I've found it's good to give the object a kind of initial kickoff that's considerably more impulse than we're adding at each tick here. And we also want to be adding even more on the z-axis, because that's the main axis that gravity is going to affect. So we are going to need another flow control variable for that. Let's go ahead and make another boolean, and let's call this kickoff. And it should default to false. We're going to throw that right in between our isFlying check and the next branch execute here. So we're going to need another branch off of false, and we're going to check kickoff. If kickoff is false, we want something to happen once and only once. What do we want to happen? We want to add impulse to that object. Great, so let's hook that up from false. Now we're going to go ahead and split the struct pins all around, because like I said, we're going to be modifying the z value directly. And for this initial, we want all of these to be higher than they usually are. So let's go ahead and multiply all of them by 2 for only this case. I don't know why it duplicated over there, but there we go. Spread those out a little. Then x and y we can just plug in directly. It's x impulse y. And we want to just add a flat value to z here rather than messing with this multiplier, because it's going to be different depending on where the object is, and that could actually lead to the object accelerating downwards faster than we would like. So we're just going to add directly to it. And through trial and error, I've found that 300 seems to be a good value for this initial kickoff. Plug that into z. Great, and now of course we don't want this to keep happening, so we need to set kickoff to true. So now in the next tick, and we're going to grab that true condition and feed that into the rest of our logic here. But of course we want the kickoff to happen again when we choose another object. So also in our little reset up here, we want kickoff to be reset to false. Then, as I said, we are constantly fighting gravity here. So we're also going to just add a little more onto the z value every time it executes. Make sure you're pulling out from the initial multiplier, not the second one where we've multiplied again by 2. Then for z here, pull out add, and I have found 15 seems to be a good feel for this. We're also going to want this to be happening more often than 10 times a second. Like I said, with fighting gravity, you got a couple options here. You could just up the impulse and keep it the same way, but I found that leads to kind of like a choppy feel. So I would use the numbers I have set up here and go over your duration here and change that to 0.04. So now that's going to be happening roughly, 1.3 times a second. To get the same time, we're also going to need to change our time elapsed check here. So let's change that to 30. Let's just double it up. And that should be just about everything we need. One more thing here. You can set it up so that your grab radius is only larger while this is in the air. And I kind of like it that way. Then, you know, you're not grabbing stuff accidentally from super far away while you're trying to use this function. So let's add something about that in. And let's go ahead and put this in kickoff, so we know it's going to happen every single time and it's not happening multiple times. We're going to grab our grab radius from grip position, which is a variable we set up in the last video. And let's go pretty generous, because these objects can get moving pretty quickly and be pretty hard to grab. So let's make it 40. And then we want to reset this to 10 in our reset function there. Okay, that should be everything we need. Let's go ahead and take a look. And one last thing I forgot to mention. For this initial kick here, go ahead and make that a velocity change, and that's going to make that behave the same way, irrelevant of the object's mass. So go ahead and click it for that one. Do not click it for this one, though, for the one that's in our main loop, just for that initial kickoff there.
Okay, so let's see if we have something that feels a little more fun, a little more dynamic. And look at that. The object just flies right into your hand, even if you move your hand a little. There is still a skill element to it. As you can see, I just failed to catch that one, so it does still take a little practice, which is fun. And it works great in the kind of medium field. It does have some issues on the far field and the near field. So let's say we head back about as far away as you can get. And you can see now they're flying in kind of low. They're still getting to the player. It's not like the end of the world. It doesn't break the function. But they definitely feel lower. And you have the opposite problem when you're very close, where that initial pop-up is going to cause the object to just fly right at the player in a way that's going to make it hard to catch. Both of those are very easy to fix. I'm not going to go over it in the video. If you'd like to do it for your own setup, I encourage you to do so. All you really got to do is create a kind of dynamic approach to that, where you take the logic we made in this video and you copy paste it a couple of times, and based on how far away you are from the object, you have different amounts of impulse added. You shouldn't need too many. Like I said, this gives you a pretty big range. You probably need 3, like 1 for near, 1 for medium, 1 for far. And that would really dial it in and really get this feeling consistent. But either way, whether you decide to set that up on your own or not, thank you for watching today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and have a great day.